June 22, 2026, the President of the United States signed an order that reads like routine paperwork. Federal agencies now have until the end of 2030 to change the way they encrypt data. Not their passwords, not their antivirus, the actual math the entire system runs on. That sounds like a technical footnote. It isn't. The Pentagon's own version of the same directive named one specific risk out loud: communications with nuclear command. And it gave itself 5 years, not 15, to fix it. Nobody announced that encryption is broken. The computer capable of breaking it doesn't exist. Not one. And yet one of the most technologically advanced governments on Earth is moving like the clock is already running.
Here's the part worth sitting with. The threat everyone's rushing to prepare for hasn't happened yet. The damage from it is already being done. Right now, while you're listening to this sentence.
To see how that's possible, it helps to remember what actually protects your messages, your bank account, your medical records online. It isn't one password. It's a math problem that's so slow to solve on an ordinary computer that trying is pointless. The most common method, RSA, rests on something almost embarrassingly simple. Multiplying two enormous prime numbers takes seconds. Reversing that, factoring the result back into its two primes, would take an ordinary computer longer than the universe has existed.
A quantum computer, if it's big enough, breaks that asymmetry. Not because it's faster at ordinary math, because for this one specific problem, it has a shortcut normal machines don't. For 30 years, that was a theory in a textbook. Interesting to mathematicians, a non-issue for everyone else, because big enough meant millions of nearly flawless qubits, and nothing like that existed or was coming soon. Then, in about a year, that number collapsed.
In February 2026, an Australian team called Iceberg Quantum published an architecture that dropped the qubit count needed to break a standard 2048-bit RSA key below 100,000. In March, researchers connected to Caltech and UC Berkeley proposed a different design built on rearrangeable atoms and landed on a comparable number, around 102,000 qubits, and just under 100 days of runtime for the fastest version of the attack.
That doesn't mean anyone has actually done it. Both results are blueprints, not built machines. Neither has passed peer review, and the honest caveat sits right there in both papers. Today's real hardware runs in the hundreds, maybe low thousands of qubits. Between 100,000 on paper and 100,000 in a room full of dilution refrigerators, nobody has closed that gap yet.
But here's what actually did change. Not the fact, but the distance to the fact. In 2019, breaking that same key was estimated to need 20 million qubits. In the spring of 2025, Google brought that down to under 1 million, a 20-fold drop. And now, in under a year, it dropped again by another factor of 10. 3 estimates, 3 drops, all inside about 7 years. And the last 2 happened within months of each other.
That trend is what put governments on edge, not just researchers. In March of that same year, Chinese cryptography professor Wang Xiaoyun said plainly that the country expects its own national post-quantum standards within 3 years. Not 10, not 20. The UK's cybersecurity agency has its own deadlines running through 2035. The EU has told every member state to secure critical infrastructure by 2030. These are governments that don't usually move fast.
So here's the obvious question. If that computer doesn't exist, why is everyone panicking now? Because you don't need the computer to exist yet to run the attack. You only need it to exist eventually. Back in 2021, the US National Security Agency laid this out in a modest internal-facing document. Some data has such a long shelf life that it's worth stealing today, storing the encrypted copy, and waiting. Cryptographers have a name for this:
Harvest now, decrypt later. Steal it now, unlock it whenever the hardware catches up.
The mechanics are almost insultingly simple. An encrypted file isn't worthless just because you can't read it yet. Not if you're confident you'll have the key eventually. It's a deposit with a delayed payout date. Stealing it today costs about the same as any ordinary breach always has. Decrypting it is somebody else's problem to solve later, while the archive just sits there and waits. The logic is blunt. If the data is still worth something in 10 years, time is working for the thief, not against him. That's worth pausing on for a second longer than usual, because everything the rest of this video says follows from it. I'm genuinely curious what you think here, especially if you work with data that has a long shelf life. Medical records, financial history, legal files. Should today's breach already be treated as a delayed fuse problem instead of a one-time incident? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to know how many people are already thinking about it that way. Let's test that logic against data that's already leaked, not a hypothetical. 80% of people reuse the same password across more than one site. Among passwords stolen in recent years, 94% turned out to be reused, meaning one stolen key opens more than one door. Out of 19 billion leaked passwords, fewer than 1 in 15 were unique. So if somewhere in an intelligence agency's archive or a cybercrime group's, there's a password database stolen 3 years ago and decrypting it becomes possible in 10 more years, it will still open some of those doors. People change passwords rarely. Almost half either never do or do it so infrequently it barely counts. Years don't make an old breach useless. They just make it quiet. Take a case bigger than one password. In February 2024, a hacking group got into the systems of Change Healthcare, a company that processes billing and insurance claims for a huge share of American healthcare. They spent 9 days inside before triggering encryption and demanding ransom. 9 days was enough to move 4 terabytes of data out the door. Names, addresses, social security numbers, diagnoses, lab results. The company paid $22 million in ransom, and it was later confirmed that 190 million people were affected anyway. The company paid to keep the files from being posted publicly, but the extortionists already had a copy. A ransom payment stops publication. It cannot undo the fact that a copy already exists, somewhere in someone's hands. And what happens to it next isn't Change Healthcare's decision anymore. A diagnosis recorded in 2024 doesn't stop being someone's diagnosis in 2034. Legal correspondence marked confidential today is still compromising in 10 years, if there's anything in it worth compromising. The damage from harvest now, decrypt later isn't abstract. It's just deferred, and it accumulates while it waits. Part of the industry isn't waiting for proof. Apple built post-quantum protection into iMessage back in 2024. Signal switched to a new key agreement method. Google has said it expects to finish its post-quantum migration entirely by 2029, earlier than any government deadline requires, citing the fact that quantum progress is outpacing forecasts. Cloudflare, which routes a huge share of the world's web traffic, reported that more than 65% of traffic from real users, not bots, is already running on the new method. In December 2025, the Bank for International Settlements ran something more serious than a lab test with the central banks of Italy, France, and Germany. They pushed real liquidity transfers between themselves through post-quantum encryption directly inside Target 2, the actual system that clears euro payments between banks every day. The transfer went through, but verifying the signature took noticeably longer than usual. Not a theoretical problem anymore, but one that anyone counting milliseconds on a trading floor will have to solve. The U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology closed the which method question in 2024, finalizing 3 specific post-quantum algorithms. From that point on, the question isn't whether a solution exists,
It's who gets there before the archives finish filling up. And that's where a market shows up, in plain sight. Sandbox AQ, a spinout from Google, has raised over $1 billion and signed a 5-year contract with the US Department of Defense specifically for post-quantum migration. Analysts disagree on how big that market actually is, by almost a factor of 4. It's young enough that nobody's measuring it the same way. But they agree on one thing. It's growing in multiples, not percentages. And then there are the ones not in a hurry yet. So when does the computer that can actually read all of this show up? The Global Risk Institute asks dozens of the world's leading physicists and cryptographers this question every year. In its latest survey, the odds they give for that computer arriving within 10 years run up to about half. Within 15 years, most of the experts they asked think it's more likely than not. A separate survey the Institute ran a year earlier asked a slightly different question. Not within how many years, but how likely by 2034 specifically, and got 1 in 3. 2 years before that, the same fixed date question got 1 in 6. However you slice it, the number's been climbing for years, not just this one.
Notice what that isn't. It isn't a forecast for 2030. It's a rising probability spread across a decade and a half. Nobody can name an exact date because there genuinely isn't one. But the gap between this is impossible and this is a matter of time is exactly the gap that got a president to sign an order, got the Pentagon to write its own strategy, and got the UK, the EU, and China to set deadlines within months of each other.
Nobody has the computer that reads the stolen archive yet, but every year it doesn't exist is another year that archive has time to grow. The 2026 order doesn't protect you from the past. At best, it protects the future. What you send encrypted tomorrow or next month under a new method built to survive a computer that doesn't exist yet. Everything you sent before that, yesterday, a year ago, 5 years ago, is already sitting wherever it's sitting, waiting.